Well, good morning. Good morning and welcome to the 145th Landon Lecture on Public Issues. The Landon Lectures were started in 1966 by the late Governor Alf Landon and the late K-State President James McCain. The goal of the Landon Lectures is to bring the most prominent public figures to Kansas State University to discuss the pressing issues of the day. We are very pleased this morning to welcome John Hoffmeister to the Landon podium to join 144 predecessors in bringing his thoughts and opinions on important public issues. Before introducing Mr. Hoffmeister, there are several guests in the audience that I would like to introduce. And I would like to start with our good friend from Fort Leavenworth. Ladies and gentlemen, Brigadier General Mark O'Neill, Deputy Commander of the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. General, thank you so much for coming today. Thank you. We're also pleased to have a member of the United States Congress here today. He is the congressman from the great 1st District, and he is a superb congressman and just a great friend of K-State, Congressman Jerry Moran. Jerry? And then we're pleased to have a dear friend of mine, and I know a good friend of most everybody in this room. He lives here in Manhattan. He's a K-State graduate, and he just so happens to be a member of the Board of Regents, and, in fact, is the chair of the Kansas Board of Regents for 2006-07, a great regent, Nelson Golly. Nelson? There he is over there. And then I would like to introduce Karen Hofmeister. Karen is a great person. She makes up a great team with her husband, John. She's the author of several leadership books. She's a star in her own right. Karen Hofmeister. Karen, there she is. Thank you very much. Well, in terms of the platform party, on my left, Mr. Roger Adams. He's a rare books librarian, and he's president of the Kansas State University Faculty Senate, and we deeply appreciate working with you, Roger, and all of your colleagues. Thank you very much. And then next to him, a rising star in Kansas and American politics. He is a senior in agricultural technology management. He's the president of the Kansas State University student body, Lucas Maddie. Lucas? And by the way, his sister, Katie Maddie, is the vice president of the student body, and if Katie's here, we ought to give her a big hand too. Katie? On my right, Mr. Edward Seaton, chairman of the Landon Patrons and editor-in-chief and publisher of our great paper, the Manhattan Mercury. Ed, thank you very much. Next to him, Dr. Charles Reagan, associate to the president, chairman of the Landon Lecture Series. He's been doing this, ladies and gentlemen, for a long, long time. And I think you know we have been very fortunate in bringing in a number of heavy hitters, like the President of the United States, the former President of the Soviet Union. And so I think we ought to thank Chuck for his great job as chair of the Landon Patrons. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased and honored to welcome John Hoffmeister to the Landon podium. He is one of the most outstanding graduates, and in fact is the 5th graduate of Kansas State University to appear as a Landon lecturer. Mr. Hofmeister is president of the Shell Oil Company, a United States subsidiary of the Royal Dutch Shell. That company is a global group of energy and petrochemical companies operating in more than 140 countries and territories. In the United States, Shell is currently the #1 branded gasoline retailer and has been a recognized pioneer and industry leader. John Hoffmeister is committed to what? U.S. energy security from diverse energy sources. Under his leadership, Shell invests heavily in new supplies of conventional oil and gas, as well as in alternative energies and energy technologies, including liquid natural gas, coal gasification, biofuels, wind, and hydrogen. Mr. Hofmeister grew up in a small town in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and worked his way through Kansas State University, ultimately earning a bachelor's and master's degree in political science. He was telling me a few minutes ago that he's been into almost every town in the state. And among the many, many jobs he had was driving a truck with fireworks where he had to deliver them to various towns. He's even been in Sun City, Kansas. Prior to joining Shell, he served as Vice President of International Human Resources for AlliedSignal Incorporated. He was responsible for developing and implementing AlliedSignal's Asian and European human resources strategy and infrastructure for its aerospace, automotive, and engineered materials businesses. Mr. Hoffmeister serves on the boards of the American Petroleum Institute, and I'm happy to tell you he's on the board of the National Urban League. He is a member of the National Academy of Human Resources. Well, given the extraordinary increase in the cost of gasoline that all of us face every day, and the threats to our national oil supply, John Hofmeister is an extremely timely and thoughtful speaker to bring here to Manhattan, Kansas. Well, John, it's a pleasure to welcome you back to K-State. You are one of our most distinguished graduates, and we love you, and please welcome John Hofmeister to the Landon podium.
President Wiefold, Dr. Reagan, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege, it is a pleasure to be at this podium today to address you on what I believe is one of the most optimistic forecasts that we can see in the years ahead for America and the world as we approach the energy requirements of the future. But first, let me commend the Landon Lecture Series for what it does to Kansas State University and the people of Kansas. I had the privilege also of meeting Governor Landon as a student, seeing him on this stage representing points of view, some of which he agreed with, some of which he did not, but always encouraging points of view to be broadcast across this great state. I had the pleasure of meeting him privately with a group of students and discussing his views during the early 1970s when, as you recall, campuses, including this campus, had its own issues with the direction of the administration. And we had a wonderful exchange of views at that time. An open-minded, receptive gentleman who I will remember all of my days. Kansas represents a tremendous asset to the energy industry, both for its history and for its future. And we will come back to that in a moment. But let me suggest to you that tempering my optimistic remarks will also be some messages of pragmatic reality which we will have to deal with in the days, the months, and the years ahead to achieve that optimistic forecast which I hope to share with you. Part of the message, ladies and gentlemen, of the energy story of the future is we are not running out of oil and gas. Contrary to the views of some who refer to peak oil as already having been reached, I would submit that that is a minority view based upon what we would consider skeptical studies, and we are far more robust in looking at the oil and gas reserves of the world. And why is that important? It is important, ladies and gentlemen, because the entire global economy, the infrastructure of the world as we know it today, whether we like it or not, is predicated on an oil and gas energy source. Whether it's mobility, whether it's power generation, whether it's heating and cooling, whether it's lighting, whatever it is, we are predicated on an oil and gas natural resource base in our economy today. Those who advocate change, and we welcome those ideas, must understand that we will continue to require massive amounts, massive reserves of oil and gas going forward if we are to sustain economic growth into the future. In this country, there is tremendous reserve of oil and gas. Kansas, as I mentioned historically, did peak in terms of its local production many years ago. The El Dorado find was one of the most prolific finds of oil and gas this country has ever known. In 1 year, for example, 29 million barrels of oil were produced in the El Dorado region, a tremendous asset to the economic development of the state and the nation. Those days have seen decline. Looking forward, however, Kansas, as you know, and Kansas State in particular has a role to play. The biofuels future of Kansas couldn't be more robust. We will come back to that a little later in my remarks. But as we look across the nation, we think about the scarcity of supply and the increased demand that we have seen over recent years. There is an explanation for the high prices. We don't like the high prices any more than you do. Every employee at Shell, including myself, pays the exact same price for oil and gas that you do. We offer no discounts inside the company. We pay the same. We feel the price at the pump as you do. What can we do about that? In this country, there has been a shortage of strategic directions for a long time. The industry has been counted upon by the national leadership to find oil and gas reserves. And ladies and gentlemen, we have. We can identify 112 billion barrels of known recoverable oil and gas in the outer continental shelf of this country and in the continental regions of this country, which we do not have access to, lacking a strategic direction by our national leadership. We have been asking for access to the 112 billion barrels of producible oil and gas in order to bring more supplies to the American people, to take away the pressure that imports present, imports which, by the way, come from regions of the world that are not always stable, not always peaceful, in which the threat of reduction in imports is always present, which leads to a dramatic rise in the price of crude oil. By developing more national resources in this country, America faces greater prosperity, greater access to oil and gas to support the economic infrastructure of the country in a regime that is peaceful, that is workable, that is predictable, where oil companies do their best work. If we had access to those 112 barrels of oil and gas, we would be in a different situation in terms of the supply-demand relationship, bringing more crude oil at possible lower prices into the nation's marketplace. But is that enough? Is that enough to satisfy the economic trends of the future and to satisfy the infrastructure of the nation? No, it's not. We need more than simply conventional oil and gas. We believe we should have access as well to unconventional oil and gas. Unconventional oil and gas is that oil and gas which is not pumped in the traditional way. It is, for example, the oil sands of Alberta. It is, for example, the oil shale of Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, where 2 weeks ago I had the pleasure with one of the distinguished senators from the U.S. Congress to walk around, ladies and gentlemen, on 1 trillion barrels of oil and gas in the state of Colorado and extending into Wyoming and Utah. 1 trillion barrels in this country represents 5 times the known reserves of the entire Saudi Arabia reserve story. 5 times. We have technology which we are testing today to get access to that oil and gas. We believe it is recoverable. We believe it is recoverable in a range of a price of crude oil between $30 and $40 a barrel. We are testing it and hope to make a financial decision within Shell by the year 2010. Working with the Bureau of Land Management, working with the U.S. Congress, we need to create the political infrastructure which will support a royalty regime that will enable the technology to be applied and successful to develop that natural resource. Will that be enough? No. We don't believe that will be enough either for the future. And so we are working in other areas. For example, liquefied natural gas. We know in this country that the reserves of natural gas are in decline. While we are temporarily at a period of great storage of natural gas, the long-term outlook for natural gas is not good for the country as a whole. And we can augment that supply through liquefied natural gas coming from abroad, in which gas is cooled, shipped, and then regassed in terminals along the coasts. But we have a problem, ladies and gentlemen. The problem is building regasification terminals, where no one seems to want a regasification terminal in their backyard. The supply is there, the market is there, but in order to move liquefied natural gas into this country, we need to build regas terminals and pipelines to move that gas from the coasts to the interior, instead of the current methodology of taking gas from the interior to the coasts. Some of those same pipelines can obviously be used, but we believe we will need more. Is that enough? No, it's not. This is a country that is naturally endowed with bountiful reserves of coal. Coal has been around for a long time, and we know coal has a dirty side to it. Ladies and gentlemen, technology has moved on. Technology exists to turn that coal into carbon-free electricity-produced energy. Carbon-free is a major step forward in the reduction of CO2 pollution, a greenhouse gas, and still gain the benefit of electricity. What is that technology? That technology is integrated gas combined cycle technology, simply called coal gasification. How does it work? Smash the coal into powder, the consistency of talcum powder. Enter that powder, dry powder, into a gasifier. Under extreme temperatures, extreme pressures, the molecules of the powder explode, yielding the components of the coal itself, which is natural gas liquids, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, sulfur, the last 3 being nasty things to deal with. But with the use of technical membranes, we can separate the CO2 and manage it through sequestration or other productive uses. We can separate the sulfur and capture it. We can separate the nitrous oxide and manage it. And the consequence of that is essentially clean energy from coal. Is it happening in the world today? Yes. In China, in Australia, in Europe, such technology is underway. Not in this country. Why? The capital cost is greater than the cost of building conventional coal-fired plants. Public utility commissions need to be better understanding of this technology so that in their wisdom they can grant rate relief to utilities to be able to install such technology at the front end of building a conventional coal plant rather than after the fact. It does require rate relief because the capital cost is more expensive. Is coal gasification enough to meet our energy requirements of the future? No, we think not. As we look ahead, we have an expression in Shell which we like to use, and that is, just as the Stone Age did not end for the lack of rocks, The oil and gas age will not end for the lack of oil and gas, but rather technology will move us forward. The technology we refer to is best captured in the term alternative energies. Alternative energies represent a small today, but growing opportunity for more energy for the world tomorrow. Such forms of energy include biofuels, where Shell happens to be one of the world's largest distributors of biofuels and believes there is a long run ahead of us in terms of biofuel development, biofuel production, and biofuel use, in particular for transport mobility purposes. Shell decided a long time ago, rather than being in the gasoline business, we are in the mobility business. And so it is our objective to bring fuels to the American people, not just gasoline. Fuels from biomass represent a good alternative, provided the engines are designed to accept this new form of biofuel, namely ethanol, which is a form of basically alcohol. And the production of such biofuels represents some future choices to be made. At Shell, we prefer not to invest our money in first-generation ethanol, which is basically corn-based or sugar-based ethanol, which is also part of the food chain. And I have to smile as the head of an oil company facing the concerns that citizens have about the high prices of gasoline. I don't think I can take much more pressure if we're also being blamed for the high price of food in the future, if the corn and the sugarcane is all being used for fuel instead of corn chips, Doritos, and high fructose syrup for Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola. Therefore, we prefer to invest our resources and invent technology or develop technology on what we consider to be second and third generation ethanol. Such ethanol comes from biomass, but it comes from the waste of the corn, not the corn kernels themselves. It comes from the corn stover, the corn stalk. It comes from not the germ of wheat, which we eat, but it comes from the stalk of wheat we call straw. The cellulosic makeup of those plants, broken down by enzyme reaction within a distillery, produces alcohol in the same manner, ultimately, as corn. And there's a whole lot of wasted biomass out there for us to utilize to turn into fuel. And in addition, third generation ethanol is taking wet biomass and gasifying that wet biomass, which could be wood chips, branches, trees, leaves, grasses, you name it, into a gasifier. And Shell is involved currently today in both technologies, investing in a company called Iogen for straw ethanol, a company called Cronin for wet biomass ethanol, and there are other technologies under development as well. Kansas State and the state of Kansas offer great opportunity for biomass development in the future. Is that enough? No. There's more. We know the sun is full of energy. Photovoltaic creation of electricity from photovoltaic cells creates electricity, solar electricity, for use in homes, offices, factories, etc. Now, Shell has moved on from silicon-based photovoltaic cells to a chemical compound-based photovoltaic cell called copper indium diselenide. Silicon itself is a highly energy-intensive product which basically comes about, as you know, from melting of sand. To melt that sand requires huge amounts of energy. To make the copper indium diselenide film takes very little energy and actually yields more electricity from sunlight. And so we're investing in that technology. Is that enough? No. There's wind. And Kansas has a lot of wind. So does Colorado, so does California, so does Idaho, so does Iowa. We have a map, ladies and gentlemen, of the windiest sections of the United States. And the Flint Hills is not one of them. So those of you who care about the Flint Hills, this is not likely to be a land of wind terminals, or wind turbines, I should say. And so there are other parts of Kansas that will absorb great amounts of wind in wind turbines. And Shell is very actively involved in the creation of wind farms. And recently I had the pleasure of standing on the island of Maui, announcing a new wind farm on Maui which with 25 wind turbines will replace the need on the island of Maui to build a new coal-fired generating plant. Then there's hydrogen. Hydrogen represents, we believe, the best chance for a technological game changer which could change energy forever as we have known it in the past. Hydrogen as the enabler of electricity generation through fuel cell technology represents for both stationary power stations or mobile power stations such as automobiles, trucks, buses, a tremendous opportunity in the future to have hydrogen fuel cell vehicles as our vehicle of choice. It exists today in Washington, D.C., 3 miles from Capitol Hill, at a Shell retail station. We have a hydrogen pump. The president himself was there to have a ride in a General Motors fuel cell vehicle and to see the tank filled with hydrogen at this Shell station just a little over a year ago. When I spoke to the president recently, I said, we need more hydrogen stations. He said, we will. We will see to it that it happens. And we're working on a hydrogen highway, ladies and gentlemen, between Washington and New York, between Los Angeles and San Francisco. There are some technological breakthroughs that we still need, particularly in the storage and distribution area, but also in the vehicle itself. The last thing you want to do is park your hydrogen fuel cell vehicle at an airport, come back 3 days later, and the hydrogen has evaporated. It doesn't get you home very quickly. So we have some work to do in order to find the solutions, and we will. Is that enough? No. The final comment I would make on energy future is, ladies and gentlemen, we need to affect the hearts, the minds, the values, and the behaviors of Americans throughout our society and move toward what we would call in Shell a culture of conservation. A culture of conservation which at the values level, changes how we see energy. I was quoted recently in a newspaper, having visited a city recently in which the hotel I stayed in during this summer had a fireplace going in an air-conditioned lobby, and the temperature outside was in the 80s. Not exactly the most efficient use of energy. That is an example of counterculture in the abuse of energy. What we need is a culture of conservation in which the minds of our technologists and our engineers are shifted towards the design of homes, the design of vehicles, the design of buildings and factories in which energy is used differently. Because it can be and it should be. And we simply need to apply it. And then in the behaviors that we use around energy, which are at a micro level, not that easy to produce, because we all like our lifestyles as we have known them in an era of cheaper, more affordable, abundant energy. But absent a culture of conservation, all the alternatives I've described will not be enough for the security of energy for our children, our grandchildren, and their grandchildren. Coming back to the price of oil, why is it so high? I do not believe we are in a permanent state of high oil price. We are suffering the effects of two dynamics at the moment in the energy world we live in. One, in the late 1990s, less than a decade ago, ladies and gentlemen, the price of crude was $10 a barrel. At $10 a barrel, the kinds of investments necessary to produce future oil were not being made. We couldn't see a return on investment at $10 oil, and decisions were deferred. In the oil business, it takes 7 to 10 years for decisions to be recognized because of the time span that it takes to move projects forward. And we can't go any faster than that because of the risks, the complexities, and the difficulties of what we do. But 7 to 10 years ago, we were in the midst of a $10 oil cycle in which we deferred decisions. So we are suffering the shortage of not having made decisions 7 years ago, which are being felt today. Second dynamic, which is also impacting us, is that for generations, we had been used to a production overhang in the OPEC countries where they were never producing all that they could produce. And through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, there were always 8 to 10 to 12 million barrels of surplus capacity not being used, but were available if needed. Between 2001 and 2004, that surplus disappeared. Where did it go? It went to China. It went to India. It went to the developing countries around the world. It also went to Europe. It also came to the United States, because our economies have been growing, thank goodness, during this entire period. Why we are suffering the high oil price today is the world produces 85 million barrels a day, and it uses more than 84 million barrels a day, and there's no surplus capacity anywhere. As a consequence, we face the extreme imbalance of supply equaling demand, demand on the verge of exceeding supply, and as a result of that, any tension in the system, any disruption of supply, causes the world trade community, who are bartering barrels of oil 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, causes them to be nervous, and it moves the price up. The nervousness is aggravated by geopolitical tensions. The geopolitical tensions we see in the Middle East today are driving the price of oil higher. There are some significant risks still out there. And while today you may be seeing a slight reduction in the pump price because of the end of the driving season and the change in behavior patterns associated with some high-priced oil and gas during the summer, we are still at the precarious edge of the demand-supply balance moving the other way. If, tragically, something were to happen in the world that somehow reduces supply, we could see a return to much higher cost oil very quickly because the demand is out there. The demand is actually good because it represents economic growth. But what the oil companies need, and what Shell is arguing for on Capitol Hill, trying to use some of the prairie pragmatism that I learned at this school, is to take the message of practical reality to our leadership in the nation's capital, to say, please, Senator, Congressman, Chairman, Director, Vice President, President, please give us more access. More access will yield more oil sooner to meet the economic growth demands of the future and take some of the tension and the pressure off the demand side by increasing the supply side. Those of you who took Econ 101, and I did 30-some years ago, I'm sure the lesson is still taught today. Supply and demand are the economic drivers which change prices. And that's what we should be working on, is an increase of supply to offset the increase in demand to yield better prices in the energy marketplace. When it comes to the Middle East, ladies and gentlemen, we watch it closely. Shell has been in the Middle East 100 years. We've been very successful working in every country in the Middle East over these years. In some cases, we've been nationalized and told to leave. In some cases, we've been invited back. We're currently working in the empty quarter of Saudi Arabia with Total, trying to find gas in Saudi Arabia. We're ready to work in Iraq as soon as security and as soon as rule of law and as soon as the invitation to work there comes. But we need all three. But ladies and gentlemen, the Middle East needs attention. The Middle East needs resolution. When I was a student here 30-some years ago, the question of the Middle East was what will happen in the next generation or in future generations if the problems are not solved. That was the discussion on campus in 1970. That is still the discussion today. What will happen if these problems aren't solved? The reason for Shell's success in the Middle East over 100 years is we talk to everybody. Everybody has a point of view. Everybody deserves to be listened to. Everybody deserves to be in the dialogue. We believe that would be a good step forward to bring more regional peace and harmony to try to move issues forward. Shell does not enter the politics of nations, not the U.S., not Israel, not Lebanon, not Iran, not Iraq. But Shell is there as a citizen to offer its view, and our view is we should all be talking to each other. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. I hope you agree with me that we can be optimistic about the future. The energy is there. We simply need to go get it. Thank you.
You can answer some questions? Well, John, thank you so much for a marvelous presentation. I don't know that I've ever heard a better explanation anytime, anywhere, of what the needs of America and the world are and some of the solutions to the energy needs that the world's going to face in the next 5 to 10 years. I think you can see he had a very, very positive point of view, and that at least the Shell Oil Company is doing everything it can to create more energy for the people of America and the world. So that was outstanding. Well, I think you all know how we work here. We have microphones on your right and on your left, and we have plenty of time for questions. So, do we have one over here?
Yes, please. Hi, Mr. Hofmeister. You mentioned I believe it was 112 billion barrels of oil off the continental shelf. Are you referring to the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve? And if not, can you address that political football?
The 112 billion barrels does include what's known in what's called ANWR, but there is so much more. The estimates in ANWR are really quite small compared to the entirety of the 112 billion barrels. ANWR is really a question for our policymakers. As an industry, we will go where we are allowed to go. We do believe that we have the technology and the wherewithal to develop resources in the Arctic Reserve in safe and sustainable ways, or we wouldn't be proposing to do so. We have, for example, taken offshore technology and learned how to reduce the platform size of operations to really postage stamp type sizes. I'm exaggerating a bit, but to move the acreage that's required for drilling down to a minuscule amount of land. We believe that with the right regulations, with the right accountabilities to the companies, so that the companies are held accountable for their actions, we believe that ANWR can be developed, but we have to leave that decision to our policymakers.
Okay, let's go over here to the left.
Yes, first of all, thank you very, very much for coming to K-State, and I really loved your Stone Age metaphor. A quick preface and a quick question. Oil companies are making record profits, the greatest in the history of money, and with these great profits, it leads to speculation about market manipulation by the oil companies. Critics point to, in the months leading up to Katrina, gasoline prices increased 3 times faster than the price of crude. And also, critics have uncovered internal oil company documents showing how oil companies have discussed ways of keeping the market tight. My question deals with the Bakersfield Refinery. One of the reasons oil companies say gasoline prices are so high is the lack of refining capacity in the United States. Shell Oil bought this refinery, which according to Shell itself, was one of the most profitable refineries in the United States, and then Shell closed it down. One of the reasons Shell said they were closing it down because there wasn't enough available crude coming to that refinery, but it's located right next to the Kern oil fields, which is one of the largest in the United States. So my question is, what's the deal with this refinery? What's happening with it? And you claim to be looking for a buyer. Have you found any yet? Who's interested in buying this refinery?
Thank you. Bakersfield is operating today. It's up and running. It is owned by another company, not Shell. Shell did make a decision to sell the Bakersfield refinery for a couple of reasons. We are a company that does best when we do things at very large scale. The Bakersfield refinery dates back to the turn of the last century, in other words, the early to middle 1900s. It was built in a very small section of land, and it basically has had community built around its gates and its fences, and as a consequence, there's nowhere to expand. Some years later, Shell bought a second refinery in Bakersfield about a mile away. Between the two refineries together, we were producing less than 100,000 barrels of gasoline today. In today's world of scale, that's a very small refinery, and it doesn't work in our strategic investment plan to get new investment. So rather than close it, we chose to sell it to a company that really works in smaller scale than we do. For example, in Port Arthur, Texas, with our partner Motiva, we're about to make a decision to build a refinery addition in Port Arthur of 350,000 barrels a day, taking that plant to 650,000 barrels per day production. That's the kind of scale that we invest in, while smaller refineries simply are better owned by other companies. But it's operating today. I do take exception to the comment on price manipulation. I don't want to go to jail. I know, but I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to see colleagues in the industry go to jail. We do not discuss prices. We do not discuss our different competitive plans. In fact, we rarely talk. And anytime we do talk, there's an antitrust lawyer sitting between us. But the industry does have to work together on some projects because of the capital intensity that's involved. But usually we choose one company or the other to be an operator, so that one company is left in charge, and therefore we speak very little to each other. Thank you.
Okay, we'll come over here, Professor Darling.
Thank you. A couple questions and then want your comments. Are you familiar with the book by John Perkins called Confessions of an Economic Hitman?
No.
Okay. Well, he talks about how international corporations have manipulated developing countries and worked against the best interests of local people. And there's a place in Ecuador called Shell. Have you been there?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Well, Shell has been despoiled by the oil exploration in that area, which brings me to my question. My question is, from your personal beliefs and value system, and then how you project that as a leader, where do you stand on environmental stewardship?
Shell has at its heart core values that are called honesty, integrity, and respect for people. As a consequence of those core values, we do not tolerate employees or managers in our company who do not act according to our values. Honesty, integrity, and respect for people extends not only internally to our relationships among ourselves, but externally to the communities and the countries in which we live. We work under the auspices of government. We do what government asks us to do, and we meet every rule and regulation that government establishes. If we find that's not economic, then we would leave a country. But as of today, the only country we have left in many years is Angola, in large part because we could not meet our business principles and continue to do business in Angola. So we have surrendered our reserves in our operating license in Angola because we will not pay bribes. We have other issues with sustainable development because what we are doing is we are destroying molecules as a consequence of finding oil and gas and refining it. That is a dirty business by definition. Having said that, countries establish rules under which we will operate. We're required to meet those rules. Our stewardship of the environment is caught up in our social responsibility code of conduct within Shell, in which for the last 9 years we have made a public report audited by third parties to demonstrate whether or not we are doing what our social responsibility mandate requires. We do make mistakes. Accidents do happen. But we are there to clean up and be accountable for our mistakes or our accidents. But in the main, we are operating, in our view, according to all the rules and regulations of the nations in which we operate.
Thank you very much. Please.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for coming to Kansas State University and delivering your lecture. My question regards natural gas, and it's very basic. What I'd like to know is what the unit of natural gas is that is sold at the international level and what the market price, the equivalent of the price that gas is being sold at an international level.
Well, natural gas hardly moves internationally except between countries that are immediate neighbors. And this country generally uses the Harvey Hub price that is set. Lately, it's been between $5 and $6 per 1,000 BTUs. As recently as last winter, it was over $15. It has also been as low as $2, $2.25 over much of the decade of the 90s. There is no international price yet of liquefied natural gas. It's either sold on a spot market or it's sold where the buyer will pay whatever it costs, or it's sold through long-term contracts. The crude price, which is the most often cited price in our industry, is set on a daily bidding basis by traders from Singapore to Dubai to London to New York, in which the oil companies themselves have very little involvement. It's done by these international trading organizations.
Mr. Hoffmeister, thank you for coming today. As a student and as an SUV driver, I thank you for your comments. I'm sure you're familiar with the group 25 by 25, and their goal is to have 25% of our energy that we consume come from renewable resources by the year 2025. Are you working currently with this board? And if so, are you optimistic about their goal and their vision to have this?
We're not working directly with 25 by 25, although we are aware of it. We're aware of quite a number of associations, and many states are also working in the same direction. I mentioned being in Maui, and the governor of Hawaii has set a goal of 20% of renewable energy by 2020, and hasn't dealt with 2025 yet. But I think we all have to work together on this. And some political leadership, who I admire and respect and hope they are successful, are calling for a national energy strategy. We applaud that effort of national leadership to call for a national energy strategy. Our job will be to get behind it. I believe the work we're doing in wind, renewables, biofuels, solar, hydrogen are going in that direction. 25% of entire energy, however, sir, is a huge, huge amount of energy considering how much gas and oil is used today. It's a noble objective. We will work towards it. It would be much easier if there were a national strategy to move in that direction.
Okay. Over here.
Good morning, Mr. Hofmeister. I'm a student in the Leadership Studies program here at Kansas State, and one of the facets in which I'm involved is our partnership with the city and the people of New Orleans after the devastation of Katrina. We've sent money, invited refugees to come study with us, and then did an alternative spring break that sent a number of students down to see the devastation on a first-hand scale. We understand that Shell is a big staple not only in the city of New Orleans, but the region of the Gulf Coast. Can you please describe some of the humanitarian efforts that you've done with Shell in the rebuilding process, and then maybe speak on any future endeavors?
As Katrina was approaching the Louisiana coast, we called a meeting of our Shell leadership team. We had shut down our platforms in the Gulf. We'd shut down our refineries along the Gulf Coast in Louisiana. And we said, there's nothing more we can do to protect our facilities. Our people are all safe. Our number one priority as the storm moves through is to ensure the safety of our employees and their families and their communities. We can't help what the storm does to the platforms or to the refineries, but we can help what happens with our employees and the communities afterwards. Since that time, we have been involved directly with the state, with the parishes, with the city of New Orleans in the restoration and the activities that are required. Talking with everyone from Don Powell, who is the president's appointee in the reconstruction, to Governor Blanco, to Mayor Nagin, and parish presidents in between. In terms of dollars and cents, we stopped counting. It's a huge number. We took 600 employees and their families out of New Orleans shortly after the storm came through and found homes and housing for another 400 who couldn't leave Louisiana for one reason or another. So we housed 1,000 people and their families for a period of 6 months. In February of this year, we returned 1,000 people back to downtown New Orleans as soon as the telephone systems and the 911 systems and the emergency response units were back up and running. Our investment in New Orleans has mainly to do with jobs. Jobs is what that city needs. It adds to the tax base, it adds to the culture of the community, and our priority was to bring the jobs back to New Orleans. We have largely done that. We have about 4,000 employees in and around the area, and the economic multiplier of our wage base in that area approaches hundreds of millions of dollars. Keeping those jobs there is the most important thing we can do. But in addition, we've worked with the police department, the fire department, all the first responders, the city, the parishes, to try to help in the recovery. Probably the most prominent visible activity was helping to underwrite Jazz Fest. Anyone who knows New Orleans knows that Jazz Fest is the event of the year, exceeding even Mardi Gras in terms of its economic impact on the community. And we made a commitment, for example, to support Jazz Fest for 3 more years after this year to see that it gets back on its feet. We love that community, we believe in that community, we believe in the human potential of that community to restore itself, but they have many problems, and we will work with them on the problems. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for, let's say, 2 more questions. Go ahead.
Hello, and thank you for coming today. Here recently, I've spent quite a bit of time looking at the energy industry as a whole, and been looking at some of the different aspects of peak oil. And I think one of the things that's most concerning in terms of energy future and how we're going to be able to really meet the tremendous increase in energy from now, and just pick any point, let's say 2050. I mean, it's going to be increasingly difficult. I think the number one thing that people are looking at is what the energy returned on energy invested is. And if you look at historically over the last 100 years in terms of how oil has moved in terms of energy returned on energy invested, it's gone from somewhere around 300, which is a lot, and is falling down maybe into the 20s. And if you look at the, I think you mentioned 1 trillion barrels of oil that may be recoverable in the Rocky Mountain region, the energy returned on the energy invested is quite low, and the same also for Canada. And I think one of the issues is that, it's fairly well known that as a whole, even on a global scale, once we get to full production with Hubert linearization, it's fairly, I don't want to say easy, but it's predictable in terms of when we should peak. And the estimates, as you mentioned, go from very pessimistic that we have already peaked until peaking very optimistically around 2035. And I guess my question is, how much risk do you feel there is in the future in terms of being wrong, in terms of being overly optimistic?
Okay.
It's a fair question. I hope I'm there to know it in 2035. We do watch carefully the energy coefficients that we are creating in the various and sundry means by which we develop energy, which is why we are a proponent of all the above. All of the means by which we can achieve an energy future, including conservation. We believe that in the whole makeup of that we will be better off, not worse off, if we develop all of these resources. But I think we will need all of them. Some will be more energy efficient than others, and they will be priced by market mechanisms, we hope, so that we use more of energy efficiency and less of energy inefficiency. But this is where the culture of conservation has a role to play. Ultimately, we believe the market will determine what is best for the outcome, not regulation. And market choice is the best way to get energy efficiency because that will be more highly rewarded. And so that's where people will pursue their research and their development. But let's not underestimate. We live in a society that uses energy frivolously. And there are many ways to achieve greater energy efficiency through conservation. And we need to put as much attention into that as we do into energy creation through energy research and development.
Okay, you've been waiting a long time. Please.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. President and Mr. Hofmeister. Thank you for coming to speak to us. My question is about your view on U.S. and China relationship from energy point of view. During your speech, you have mentioned twice about China as an energy industry leader. I'd like to hear your view. The background is I'm a Chinese language instructor. Last year, we offered Chinese language here on campus. And this spring, it was the first time we offered Introduction to China course. Our president has sent delegation to China this summer, and we're working with Chinese universities. So I think energy, U.S.-China has been very much attention in the world. So I want to hear your point of view.
We could talk a long time about China and energy and U.S., and I believe it is a good relationship. My wife Karen and I were in China as recently as July, and we were amazed over the last 10 years since we used to live in Hong Kong how much China economically has advanced and grown and prospered. And of course it is on the back of greater use of energy. And where there used to be very, very many bicycles in many Chinese cities, now there are very few bicycles and very many cars. And so the lifestyle has changed dramatically, all of which requires more energy, not just the energy of fuel, but the energy of production of automobiles. We believe that there is great opportunity for the two nations to work together on energy solutions. I mentioned coal gasification. Shell is currently gasifying more than 14 license agreements in China electrical generation plants, bringing the technology I described to China for clean coal conversion of electricity to electricity. We're also working with China government and provinces on various and sundry projects to develop the petrochemical industry in the south of China, for example, LNG in Guangzhou, or perhaps one day in Shanghai or in Dalian. We visited recently Beijing, Dalian, and Shanghai, and we are closely working with PetroChina, China National Overseas Oil Company, and other Chinese petrochemical industries to try to develop the economy in ways that use energy efficiency. Also working with universities in China on hydrogen research and other kinds of fuel research to try to bring together what the two countries can use together. Because quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, as goes China, as goes the United States in terms of energy usage in the world, so goes the world. So let's work together on that.
Well, we might as well get one more, huh?
Yeah, thank you very much. You're a little bit younger than me, so you may not be able to answer this question. I worked for Mobil Oil and Petroleum Marketing in the late 60s and up to the mid 70s. And I was in central Kansas, and this was a very competitive state because of the independent oil producers like Skelly Oil and others that I don't remember because it was a long time ago. But my question of you is, and I've always wondered, after I left that, the oil industry changed in its approach to marketing and its approach to probably refining and most every other capacity. How did, since you brought up the subject of antitrust violations, and I do know of some people also that went to jail in the oil industry for price manipulation, how did the oil industry and the country decide which states that oil companies would get out of? Mobil Oil left Missouri and Kansas and some other states. Phillips stayed in Kansas, and that happened throughout the rest of the country. And I'm not implying anything that was wrong. I just have always wondered how the country was divided up and which oil companies decided to get out of which states. Thank you.
I must confess that I'm not a historian of the oil industry and have been with the industry just 10 years. I know that as we look at markets as Shell, we look at all 50 states as potential markets and try and determine which markets offer the best opportunity for our branded products to be sold. Now, we have adopted a business model in Shell in which if we are going to be present in a retail market, 90% of our market will be disaggregated to wholesalers. In other words, we don't own the property, we don't own the station, we don't own the pumps, we don't own the distribution channel in most cases, we own the brand. And so people choose to use our brand and bring our branded product to customers. But to use our brand requires certain standards of health, safety, and environmental responsibility, certain standards of business principles, certain standards of cleanliness and appearance of the station and so forth. But it's an independent business person who is choosing to use the Shell brand rather than Shell saying, we will put a station there or we will put a station there. Because of our deep concern for antitrust, we find that a disaggregated business model in which many hundreds or thousands of business people in local communities choose us and to bring our products to that local market, is a far better way both for economic development of local markets. It's also a way of not having the issue of antitrust to face, because we're not a decision maker in terms of which station goes where or what price is set where. It's simply being done by our wholesale community as independent business dealers using the Shell brand. With respect to your question in the past, I'm sorry I don't have an answer.
Well, that's it. Thank you very much. Great job. Excellent job.